Thank you very much for the introduction, and welcome back after the lunch break. Speaking after lunch is not always easy, so at any point in time you feel the need to doze off, you have my permission. All right. As I think you have had some previous presenters talking about social networks, so I'm guessing this may not be entirely new for some of you. But my plan for this session is to do three things, right? So I want to start by first talking a little bit about the theoretical foundations of social networks so that I understand that some of you might be new to this topic. So I want to give you some introduction to what is social networks, why do we need social networks, what are some foundational concepts in social networks. For the second part, I want to focus more specifically about an empirical problem in social networks, which is about estimating social or peer influence, right? So a lot of you might be working on causal inference problems in your studies. So estimating social influence in networks is a causal inference problem, a network. So this is a specific type of network problem that I want to focus on. And then finally, towards the end, I'm going to briefly introduce and discuss a couple of studies that I've done in the past or I'm currently working on, and hoping that some of this might resonate with what you're interested in, okay? And I mean, please feel free to interrupt me at any point in time. If you have any questions or clarifications or something that doesn't make sense, just stop me and we can have a plan. Right, so I've been giving this talk for quite a while now, and I generally start this particular talk with this slide here. So, I mean, if you haven't been living under a rock, you'll probably be able to recognize this TV show, right? It's from Game of Thrones. The actors should be familiar to you, but can anyone guess what those links mean in the network? So the nodes are actors in the show, but what are these links denoting, right? The font size is deliberately small so that you can't read it off the slide. Can anyone guess? What is this network representing?
Who killed who, or like who betrayed who?
All right, so that's actually pretty good. I mean, it's the first time that someone's guessed it at the first attempt. This is a network, it's a betrayal network of which character betrays which other character in the first 6 seasons of the show, right? From season 1 to season 6. And why do you think some nodes are larger in size and some nodes are smaller? I'd be able to guess.
They are the main characters.
In the context of this network.
The more powerful person.
Betrayed the most.
Yes.
So,
So it's a betrayal network, and the node size is proportional to who betrays people the most, right? So it's proportional to the number of connections that the node is linked to. And why do you think some links are thicker than others? There are some links that are thin, there are some links that are thicker. What do you think that's representing? So for instance,
frequency,
what's that?
frequency, magnitude.
Frequency of betrayal, no.
Strength of betrayal.
Stress,
Strength.
strength of betrayal. So like, what would that mean?
Like it's a big betrayal.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, so it's it's the impact of the betrayal, right? So if someone kills someone, it's a thicker link. If someone cheats someone, it's probably a thinner link. So it's the impact of the betrayal that's being represented here. So I like starting the talk with this because it really kind of shows the usefulness of representing something in a network, right? Even if you've never watched the show, if you just look at this picture long enough, you'll get a sense of what's going on in the show, right? So in general, like if you think about social systems, complex systems that you see in society, you see that any complex system can be kind of reduced to these independent or interdependent components that interact with each other in interesting ways. What's more interesting for this particular network is the relationships are not actually social relationships, right? So the links are not some kind of family or house relationships. They're actually denoting some kind of interactions. So in this case, it's an interaction network, not a social network. And the interactions here are betrayal-based interactions, right? And so the reason I also wanted to show this is because increasingly, these kind of interactional networks are more and more common in the field, moving away from the more classic social networks, because social network data is very hard to obtain. So there's a lot of studies now focusing on these kind of behavioral networks. And the reason for that is mentioned below, right? It's like it's generally hard to get access to real-world social networks. However, accessing interaction and behavioral networks is relatively easier. Okay? Not to suggest that the study of networks began with HBO, it's been going on for a couple of centuries at least. I mean, based on my own research, I would say that the earliest systematic study of a network of any kind can be traced back to the early 19th century. This person called Pierre Huber, who studied insects as a profession, and he wrote a book, a thesis, and one chapter in his thesis focused on the dominance network in bumblebees, in bees, right? So in bees, bees have a very complex social network. You have like a queen bee, you have slave or worker bees, and they're all connected with them in a very tight hierarchy. And in 1802, and I think the book came out in 1810, there was a first systematic description of a social network of bees. So it's at least a couple of centuries old. Around the same time in the city called Kaliningrad, so it's Königsberg at the time, the current city is called Kaliningrad in Russia. There was Leonhard Euler, again, a very famous Swiss mathematician, engineer, physicist, and many other things. And he actually, he was walking around the city and he thought of this problem that, imagine if there is a city which has 4 pieces of land, right? So 2 mainland and 2 islands, and they're connected by bridges. So the green links are bridges. And the problem that he was thinking of is, how do you traverse each part of the city by crossing each bridge exactly once? So that's the problem. That's the problem they're trying to figure out. Is it possible to do it in this case? And he was able to figure out a solution. But one of the things that he mentioned as part of the solution was, it doesn't matter what's going on inside the land masses. You can reduce the entire piece of land to a dot, and the 2 dots can be connected by a link, which is a bridge. And so you could reduce this whole map to a graph. And so a lot of his early work creates the foundations for graph theory, what we know as graph theory today. So the reason I'm showing you this is to highlight that the foundations of a systematic study of networks, at least a couple of centuries old, coming from different parts of the world. It just so happens that the 2 people I'm talking about here are both from what currently we call Switzerland. If you're interested in understanding or reading about the history of social networks, I would strongly recommend this particular book. I think it's available at the NUS library. There's a free version online. It's really small, tiny book. You can read it on your flight back. And it tells you about how the field of social network analysis originated from anthropology, mathematics, social psychology, and kind of converged into what it is today. So I think if any of you are interested in history, I think this is a very nice book, and it's a very concise book by Linton Freeman that you can read. Right, so given that background, one other reason why I feel that a talk on networks fits in pretty much any kind of summer school, whether it's some computational social science or psychology or mathematics or data science, is because you tend to realize that network structures are universal. Some of you might be studying social media networks, some of you might be studying other kinds of political networks or economic networks. What you end up seeing is very similar kinds of structural patterns in different kind of contexts. And to kind of highlight this point, I'll show you a very extreme example of this, because it's a very interesting study. This is a paper that came out in Science in, I think, 2010. And I kind of read this paper the week it came out. I was like super amazed. And I've been using it like in every talk since then. This is a study that was done by researchers at University of Hokkaido and University of Oxford. And they wanted to study how, slime molds? Like it's single-celled organisms called slime. They look like fungus, but they're not exactly fungus. And you sometimes see it after heavy rain. You see this slime on like wooden, like decaying wood. And the nice thing about a slime mold is that even though they're single-celled organisms, you can actually see it with your naked eye. It's big enough for you to see it directly. You don't need a microscope. So what the scientists did in that study was they took a slime mold, they put it in a Petri dish, and they sprinkled some oat flakes around the slime mold. So oat flakes are, you can think of it as a kind of a food that slime molds really like. And so what happened over time is, this yellow dot that blob in the middle, that's the slime mold. And those white dots around it are the oat flakes. So they sprinkle the oat flakes around it. And so over time, say that for A over there is 0 hours and like 5 hours, 8 hours, 11 hours, you kind of see the slime mold spread out uniformly in all directions to try and reach the food particles. And then gradually over time, you see that it forms these food tunnels, that some of the paths get reinforced and some of the paths disappear over time. And you end up, after 26 hours, roughly a day, you'd end up with a number of really solid food tunnels, and the rest of the paths kind of decay and disappear. All right? And this is known behavior. Slime molds are known to form this kind of a food network when they're looking for food. So why is this interesting? Why was this published in Science? Well, when I explained this kind of figure to you, what I deliberately missed was the location of these oat flakes. So when the researchers sprinkled the oat flakes, they didn't do it randomly. So the position of the oat flakes in this map coincides with the location of cities around Tokyo. So the slime mold is where, it coincides with Tokyo, and the other oat flakes coincide with stations of cities around Tokyo. And so what they were able to find was after 26 hours, again, this is a single-celled organism, right, with no cognitive property, was able to create a food network tunnel that now resembles, in terms of the graphical structure, the train network around Tokyo, right? So they were able to get the train network structure, and they showed that the graph structure of the existing rail network around Tokyo roughly coincides with what the slime mold was able to construct in just 24 hours, right? And so again, this was brilliant, right? Because this is a single-celled organism that forms these tunnels using very simple heuristics, but it somehow still manages to create a near optimal set of routes between these food centers. And so I think they were amazed at how they do it. And so this paper proposes a biologically inspired model for coming up with optimal paths for in networks. So this is actually the actual Tokyo network and the mold network. So if you maybe visually, you might be able to see there are some similarities in terms of like the clusters. But I mean, there are ways to quantify graph distance between two networks, and they found that's actually quite similar, right? I don't think they checked which, so they took the actual Tokyo network as kind of like the ground truth for what is optimal, because it was like redeveloped many times over the years by engineers. So they assumed that this is an optimal train network. And so to what extent does the mole network resemble this optimal network? But I think more importantly, the paper proposed a very simple mechanism by which you can come up with something that looks like the Tokyo network using very simple steps, right? So then this is get it like a generative model for coming up with these networks that's biologically inspired by a slime mold, right? It's a pretty interesting study. Now, sometimes networks are not directly observable, right? So this is, again, a very interesting case of a movie network where, again, this network doesn't exist. The nodes here are characters from a movie, right? I probably can guess which movie this is. Right? Lord of the Rings, right? And so you have nodes that are the movie, the characters in the movie, and then what do you think the links denote here? In this particular case? So the links here are co-occurrences in a scene. So there are two characters that co-occur in a particular scene in the movie. There is a link between them, and the frequency of co-occurrence is the strength of the link, right? And so again, if you have not seen Lord of the Rings, and I just show you this movie network, you get a sense of who are the main characters in this movie, and who do they interact with, right? So this is a multi-character movie network. This is another example of a multi-character movie network, right? And any guesses what movie this is? I don't know if you're old enough to remember.
Godfather?
Godfather? Yes,
Yeah.
but I mean, you reveal your age, but it is Godfather, yes. There are also egocentric movies where you have, again, you look at these networks and you see they look very different from the previous network, right? You have one central node, it's almost like a star network. And again, if you have not seen Schindler's List or Forrest Gump, you look at these networks and you get a sense that these are single actor, single character focused movies, all right? Okay, so this is again a completely different unrelated context. This is also from a paper published in Scientific Reports. The paper is on something else, but what this is showing you is co-occurrence of ingredients in a food recipe. So for those of you who like cooking, each node here is an ingredient, and if two ingredients co-occur in a particular recipe, they're connected by a tie, and the clusters, so they are colored based on the cultural preference, right? So you can just, again, if you have never entered a kitchen in your life, if you just look at this network, you get a sense that there's some kind of ingredients that are very specific to certain cultures, and there's certain other ingredients that are kind of crossover. Like, so if you look at garlic, it seems to be a crossover ingredient between Southern European, Latin American, and East Asian cultures. But if you look at something like, I don't know, thyme, it's very clearly, not Asian, right? So we don't use thyme in Asian cooking. So this is, again, a very nice use of networks in trying to understand how cultures around the world share ingredients, right? So I've shown you all these different examples of networks in very, very unrelated contexts. And you might be wondering, hey, how do we begin to kind of understand whether these networks are similar or dissimilar, or how do we quantify these networks, right? Like visually, they look very different and they're all from different contexts, but how do we begin to quantify these networks? So that's where I think some kind of mathematical formulation is important. Again, if you have some exposure to network studies or some graph theory course that you've attended, you might be familiar with node level properties and node level attributes. So in a network, a node level attribute could be something that's individual specific. So if a node is an individual, a node level feature or node level attribute could be their gender or age, education, income, the control variables that you add in a model, right? However, you could also have network-based attributes of the node. And here, I think a lot of studies ask this question, given a network, how do we know whether a particular node is a central node or not, right? So that's where we come to this term called centrality of a node in a network. And there are various ways of defining node-level centrality. So the most common centrality measure, arguably, in network studies is this idea of degree centrality, which basically means the number of connections a node is connected to. So you have a node, the number of links is its degree. However, if a network is a directed network, so if you have a direction to the tie, right? So if A to B is not the same as B to A, then you can also split degree into in degree and out degree, depending on how many outgoing connections and how many incoming connections you have for a particular node. So mathematically, so out degree would be sum of Aij, where Aij is this particular matrix. We call it an adjacency matrix in network science, right? So it's basically a matrix where the rows and columns are the nodes. And if there is a tie, you have a 1. And if there's no tie, you have a 0 or it's a missing value, right? And so an out degree would be something like this, right? So an out degree of C would be the number of links that begin at C and go outwards. So in this particular matrix, the out degree of C would be 3, right? So you have C to B, C to D, and C to E. And the in degree of C would be 1. So there's only one link from, that starts at C and ends at C, right? So this is one example of a centrality measure, which is very popular. There are also other centrality measures that you can use to measure other things about the node. So for instance, closeness centrality is a measure of how near or how far a particular node is from all other nodes in the network. So mathematically, it's the inverse of the distance of that node I from all other nodes in the network. So Dij in network science terms is called the farness of a node. And if you take the inverse of the farness, you get the closeness. So Dij here is, so if you take a node I and a node J, the distance between I and J is the shortest path between I and J. All right. It's not, keep in mind, distance is always the shortest path. There could be many paths in the network between two nodes. The shortest path is the distance. You do it for all nodes from I, so all pairs of nodes, starting with I, and then take the inverse of that, you get closeness. And it's a measure of how close a node is from all other nodes in the network. All right. Also, there's another popular measure called betweenness centrality. And again, this uses the concept of shortest path. And basically, if you just look at the function over there, it tells you what portion of the shortest paths in the network includes that node I. So think about it, right? You have a network, you take all pairs of nodes in the network. So for every pair of nodes, you have a shortest path. And the betweenness of I is the proportion of those shortest paths that include I. So conceptually, what this means is it tells you how important is this node in terms of like sitting on a shortest path in the network. So a node that has very high betweenness is a node it serves as a broker between multiple parts of the network. So it kind of sits as a bridge. So if you want to go from one part of the network to another, you have to cross this particular node. That's why it has high betweenness. Right? Now I just showed you 3: degree, closeness, and betweenness. There are at least 50 others that I could talk about in terms of centrality measures. But I think the point I want to highlight is this. So if someone shows you a network and asks you, given this network, which is the most central node? The question that you should ask is, well, what kind of centrality are you looking for? Right? So it depends. So if you look at this network, there are different nodes that are central nodes depending on what measure you select, right? So again, different measures of centrality capture different aspects of centrality. And so if you're looking for popularity, you'll probably be looking at degree. If you're looking at reachability of a node from other nodes, you look at closeness. If you're looking at something like brokerage potential, you probably look at betweenness, right? And then there are other things like eigenvector centrality, for instance, which we didn't look at. Eigenvector centrality measures how important are your neighbors. That's also an interesting centrality measure, right? So maybe I'm not an important person, but Elon Musk is my friend. So then that inflates my importance. So then I have high eigenvector centrality, even though Elon Musk is my only friend. So my degree is low, but I'm still an important person because my only friend is a very important person, right? So there are different measures of centrality that capture different aspects. Just wanted to highlight that here. The other usefulness of doing this exercise is, given a network of individuals, you can now do profiling of individuals based on their network position, right? So imagine, it's just an illustration. If you just have 3 centrality measures, if you look at combinations of these centrality measures, you get very different types of individuals. It's almost like personality profiling, right? So if you have someone who has high degree, but also low closeness, what kind of individual is this? So this is a person who is in a very specific and dense cluster, which is why the person has a lot of connections, right? High degree, but that entire cluster is far away from the rest of the network, which is why it has low closeness. So if I just give you some combination of these centrality measures, you can actually say something about the network position of this individual, right? So then this is a very useful exercise that you can do once you're able to quantify these centrality measures for these nodes. All right? So, okay, let me pause here because so far, all that I've told you is, given a network, how do you quantify certain node level properties of that network? But everything's still static. In the next part, I'm going to talk about, well, how do these networks even form over time, right? So far, all the discussion so far is on static networks. But then there are generative processes that lead to network formation that I want to talk about next. But let me pause here for a second to see if there's anything that sounds like looks confusing or weird that you want to clarify. So far, so good. All right, you're with me so far? Okay. Now, for the next part, let me begin with a particular anecdote, right? A story. So imagine you're at a party or a summer school, that matters, right? So at a conference. So let's say that, okay, let's take this example. So you meet each other for the first time at the summer school with 100 people, few of whom know each other. I'm assuming you're meeting each other for the first time in the summer school. So over time, when you have the networking session, you kind of see pairs of 2 or 3 people chatting in their small groups. And then as in any networking session, over time, these groups change, right? So you say hello, and then you move away and you meet someone else and you chat with that person for 2 minutes, you move away and talk with someone else, right? So you see groups forming and separating over time. Right? So over time, these groups change, some leave to chat with other groups. Now here's the interesting bit. In that group of 100 people, exactly one person, X, knows a really nasty rumor about you, something that you don't want people in the group to know, something uncharitable about you, all right? So here's my question. So by the time the party ends, the networking session ends, how many people at most out of these 100 people would know this rumor about you, assuming everyone gets kind of chatty after a few drinks, right? So if I know the rumor and I meet someone, I spill it, all right? That's one assumption. The second assumption is no one talks to more than 1 or 2 people. So there's no like social butterfly that everyone gathers around this person, right? So there's these 2 assumptions. So imagine, right? Say the 100 people, everyone's just chatting in groups of 2 and 3. You speak for a few minutes, you break away, you meet someone else, but no one talks to more than 1 or 2 people for the entire night, on average. Yeah. But the assumption is if you know the rumor, even if you're talking for 1 minute, you spill it, you share it. But it begins with only one person. Only one person in the room knows the rumor. By the end of the night, what percentage of this 100 people do you think would know this rumor about you?
Everyone.
Yeah,
Everyone?
definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, so everyone, and anyone who says like 2 or like sometimes on the other side? Someone in the middle, safe answer, 50, 60.
I think we also need to consider like the length of the conversation because every conversation took like 7 hours.
Yeah, so let's assume that conversations are short, but no matter how short the conversation is, if the party in the conversation knows the rumor, they will share it with the other person.
So it should be everyone.
But no one meets more than 1 to 2 people, at most. So through the entire night, you meet only 2 people.
That's the limit.
That's a limitation.
How long was the party?
Yeah, that question comes up quite often. Let's assume for a reasonable period of time.
3 hours?
Okay, let's take 3 hours. Right, that's a good question. Yeah, I think it's a reasonable period of time. It's not a short party. But I think that assumption in red, that's the I would say the even if it lasts 6 hours, no one's talking to more than 2 people. So let me give an extreme example, right? So imagine the person who knows that rumor, that one person is extremely popular or extremely active. So that person goes and talks to like everyone, and then everyone would know in an instant, right? But then that limiting assumption in red prevents that from happening. So there is no social butterfly. There's no one's talking to more than 2 people.
But 2 to 5's power can be 128. So only 2 guys talk to another 2, and they can double and double and double. So very soon.
People already know more than
1 or 2.
So every time you just talk to a stranger, like only.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily.
Okay.
No one talks to other than 2 people. For example, like these people pass this rumor to me, and then I can only pass it to 1 people.
Max 2. Max 2. So it doesn't matter whether you have the rumor or not. you're not talking to more than 2 people throughout the entire night. So which means if you have spoken to 2 people and you don't have the rumor, too bad. Yeah, you're not talking to more than 2. Right? So actually, before we can answer that question, I want to show a simulation. Don't you? Can you show a YouTube video?
You can just and we can stop here and we share it.
Okay, can share this.
We share the desktop.
Okay, all right. Yep, I think you can see it. So take a look at this network here. This is a network where you have nodes and you have links that are forming at random with some probability, right? So if you look at this number here, this is the number of nodes in this network. And this here is the average number of connections. Okay, the average number of links a node is connected to in the network. So obviously it starts with very small amount because almost none of the nodes are connected, right? And you see what happens where, so the way this is the generative model, the way it works is 2 nodes are picked and a link is formed with a probability P and not formed with a probability 1 minus P. A very simple model. Just keep an eye on this number here, which is the average number of links a node has. Okay. And notice something interesting happening around the 1 mark. I mean, the color change is just for illustration, but okay, so this is like at 1.2, but you see something change at this stage compared to when the simulation started, right? And then if you let the simulation run using that same model, and let me just forward it a bit. This is at 2.6. An average number of connections, 2.6. All right. So you can see that most of the nodes are now connected as part of this core network with a few nodes on the periphery that are not connected anymore. And I think by the time it goes to something like this, almost every node is connected. Right? So again, to go back to the point I was making here, this is at 1. All right, you see something interesting happening here. So this is what's called in random networks as, let me go back to this. I need to start. Here. So this is actually what's called an Erdos-Ronny network, ER network, a random network. So what researchers have actually found is when the average degree of a random network increases, something very interesting happens when the average degree reaches a value of 1. If you look at the x-axis over there in that plot, so yeah, sure.
Share your presentation screen. So
no, okay. Okay, thanks. Yeah, so if you increase the average degree on the x-axis, you see something interesting happens around the k equal to 1 threshold. So the y-axis here is the proportion of nodes that are connected in the network. So the giant component is it's a bunch of nodes that are all connected, all right? So it's a giant component because it's the single largest connected component in the network. That's why it's called a giant. Okay? So what this is basically telling you is that when the average degree of the network crosses 1, you tend to see the emergence of a giant component where most of the nodes are connected in one path. And then this quickly becomes connected over time. And so by the time your average degree comes close to log of n, where the n is the number of nodes, almost all the nodes are part of this single largest component. So the point of showing this is, if you have a network that's being formed at random, even if you, on average, you just have one link, there's a chance that you are all connected as part of one connected component, which is a prerequisite for something to spread. Again, that's not to say that something will spread, but that's the prerequisite that you need for anything to spread, whether it's a piece of rumor or a virus or anything, right? So you need a connected component first. But what this shows you is that the bar for that is actually pretty low. You only need an average degree of 1. So as long as a person has a degree of 1 on average, there is the prerequisite for something to spread. And of course, not everyone will have a degree of 1, right? There will be some nodes will have a degree of 20. There will be some who might have a degree of 1. But on average, it has to cross 1, right? So this was an interesting exercise that comes out of the random networks literature. And this insight is I think it came out in 1950. So it's very old. It's one of the classic insights in random networks. It comes to on the topic of how networks form over time. Right? So all right, so to summarize, right? So what we have seen so far is that you have a bunch of actors or nodes that are interdependent, right? So they're all connected to each other. And based on how they form these links, you end up with these different kinds of network structures, right? So far in the previous example, I showed you what a random network looked like, but then there are also other kinds of variants of network structure that you can get, such as a small world network or the scale-free network, which you can generate based on different modeling assumptions, right? So I'm not talking about those specific network structures, but just wanted to highlight that depending on what your generative mechanism is, you can end up with different kinds of network structures. And then what's interesting, and this is where it goes to my next part of causality, is that these network structures in turn create constraints or influence your individual behavior, right? So it's kind of a cyclical process. So you form your ties, which leads to these network structures, and then these network structures in turn create forces on the individual nodes on how you change your behavior, right? And then the different studies that try to estimate one side of this direction or the other, or both, right? But this is actually it's kind of pretty much all network studies fall somewhere in this cyclical pattern here. Now, before I get to the second part of the talk, I do want to have a disclaimer here. I don't want to oversell the benefit of networks, right? So there are limits to what you can do with that framework that I just showed you, right? So I think, yes, I'm personally convinced that our networks are important drivers of our individual behavior. They influence pretty much every aspect of our lives. But there are at least 2 limitations that I want you to keep in mind as you go forward. First, and again, you might have heard this phrase, bounded rationality. And it's a very simple idea. So when you talk about a social network, and if the hypothesis is that your network influences your behavior, then you're making an assumption that you can mentally access your network, right? And so it's just a simple exercise. If I ask you, how many best friends do you have? You probably would be able to give me an answer, right? Like 5, 3. And then if I ask you, well, how many best friends do your best friends have? And do you know them? You probably don't know them, right? And so this is a problem of bounded rationality, that even though the network structure exists, if you cannot cognitively access the network, you cannot make decisions based on that. But in many studies, and I have done studies where I've used network features to predict individual outcomes, but this is a major limitation to that, right? This bounded rationality creates these constraints. Similarly, there are other kinds of cognitive constraints. There's this very famous, I wouldn't say study, but it's a concept called Dunbar's number. Has any of you heard of this term called Dunbar's number? Yeah. So it comes from, so the name Dunbar comes from Robin Dunbar, who's a British evolutionary psychologist / evolutionary anthropologist. And he came up with this series of studies where he looked at the brain sizes of non-human primates, so the size of your neocortex relative to your body. And he found that the size of your neocortex in the brain relative to your body is a good measure of the stable group size that you can maintain, right? So he came up with this number of 150 based on a study, and this has been debated with many studies that criticize, any one number. But the idea is you can only have 150 stable relationships in your life. So anything more than that, you cannot cognitively maintain. And there have been criticisms of this. Like some people have said that, how do you know it's 150? When it's 149? When it's 160? Right? So is there an actual number? But I think everyone agrees that there is a cognitive limit to how many stable relationships we can keep in mind at any given point in time. And not just cognitive limits, there are also like lifestyle limits. So if you hang out with your friends, you cannot hang out with 2,000 friends, right? So there are physical limits to what you can do with your network. And I think this creates a constraint on what we can model, all right? So I just wanted to highlight these two limitations. And again, right after the session, I'll actually share with you some reading material if you want to read more about some of these things in detail, yeah? So with that, with that disclaimer, I want to now get into the second and concluding part of my talk, where I specifically want to discuss a topic in social networks that's of personal interest. This is something that I've done my PhD on, and it's a hard problem, but I want to introduce to you because I think it resonates with a lot of work that you're doing in different areas. So I'm hoping that this might be of some interest to you. So it's the problem of estimating social influence in a social network, in statistical terms, is basically that of inferring causal estimates. It's a causal inference estimation problem on networks. Let me give you an example of what this means. So let's take this illustrative network here. And let's say I'm interested to know that if Diana votes for party A in the next election, what is the likelihood that Carl will also vote for the same party, given this network? All right?
A either.
What's that?
A.
Also A.
No, are you asking a question? No, I'm not asking this question to you. I'm just posing this question as an example of what the social influence problem here is. Yeah. First, should there be any association to begin with? Okay. Like, does it even matter that they're connected to each other in a network? Right? Should there be any association in voting behavior? Second, if we do find a significant association, can we attribute this association to the friendship between Carl and Diana? Sorry, it's actually Carl and Diana, not Alice and Bob. All right. So can we attribute the behavior similarity to the link between Carl and Diana? And this is the outcome that I'm interested in: peer influence, social influence. All right. And finally, yes, if the answer to 2 and 3 is yes, then why should I care? What do I do with this insight? And then you can imagine if I'm like a campaign manager running the election campaign for like Joe Biden, for example, and I see that there is peer influence in voting behavior, then I can intervene on Diana or Carl, and I know that the intervention would spread to their immediate neighbors, right? So I can use the network to run election campaigns, etc. Right? So there will be a network effect. So these kind of peer influence has been studied extensively in many different fields of work. So for example, in marketing, this is a very, very common finding, right? So you might have heard of this term called word of mouth marketing, WOM, or we call it buzz marketing. So the idea that consumers tend to listen to other consumers more than marketers is a well-established finding in marketing literature. Similarly, in healthcare, there are many applications where you have peer interventions as a healthcare intervention, so especially in like addiction control, alcoholism, substance abuse. You tend to make use of sponsors who are peers, who tend to help with keeping addiction in control. So there are many applications where the network is used as a positive intervention in many different domains. And in all these contexts, estimating peer influence becomes useful. All right, so this is just an example of questions or research questions or papers where we've actually studied how social networks affects different kinds of behavior. So the behavior is in red, right? So I've worked on problems where we have looked at how the network effects affect content generation in online platforms on social media. So is there peer effects? There are papers in marketing and information systems, in economics, where they look at effects of the network on product adoption and diffusion of services. And finally, in public health, again, this is a very common area of networks. We look at how peer influence exists in how, alcoholism or smoking or substance abuse spreads in a network. Is there peer effect, right? So there are pretty much, these peer influence problems are there in pretty much every discipline that you can imagine, both in social science, but broadly in other kinds of related disciplines as well. So what does it mean? So I want to give you this mathematical formulation to explain how the peer influence problem on networks is different from a causal inference problem that you study in a non-network setting, like what you're probably familiar with. So in a standard causal model, this is like, I'm simplifying a bit here, but this is what you're studying, right? So for a person A, you're intervening on a particular attribute of that person A. So maybe there's a treatment or intervention on XA, and you want to study the effect on some outcome Y, right? So XA on YA. So I've taken a sample study, and this is actually from a real study. Does providing crop insurance training to farmers increase their adoption of insurance plans? So this is a causal inference problem from economics. So I take a group of farmers, I enroll them in a training program, and I want to see that the ones who enrolled in the program show a higher adoption rate. So they buy crop insurance more than the ones who did not enroll for the training program, right? So this is a schematic of this, right? So you have an intervention in time T1, you have two farmers, A and B, and you have farmer C. So A and B get the training program, C does not. So C is your control group. And what you're expecting to see is at time period T2, the farmer A buys the crop insurance, B buys the crop insurance, but C does not. This is your treatment effect, right? Now, this is what happens in a non-network setting. This is a causal inference problem in a non-network setting. Now, let's complicate this a little bit. So now, what about you intervene on XA, similar to this, but instead of tracking the effect on YA, I'm interested in the effect on YB, on a different farmer. So this is what it means. Similar setting, period T1, farmer A gets the training program, farmer B does not, all right? But then at T2, surprise, surprise, both farmers purchase the crop insurance, even though farmer B did not directly get the treatment. However, I have an additional piece of information that farmer A and farmer B are connected in a social network. Maybe they're neighbors in the village, right? So maybe this is the causal pathway that flowed, right? So farmer A got the treatment, but the treatment spilled over to farmer B through the network. And so the estimating this effect on farmer B is the peer influence problem. So farmer A's behavior affecting farmer B's behavior post-treatment. This is the peer influence problem that we have to solve in this context. And these are the kind of problems I'm generally interested in, okay? Now, this is, again, when you look at the network literature on peer effects, it's a very common finding that farmer A and farmer B would have correlated behavior because they're neighbors, right? So in networks, we see that users who are connected or like individuals in the dyad tend to show correlated behavior as compared to two randomly picked nodes. This is a known behavior in networks, right? And one reason for this, as what I showed in the previous slide, is influence, that one node learns from the other node in a dyad, okay? But life is not easy, right? There are many other reasons why the two nodes could be showing correlated behavior. There are many other confounding factors that prevent you from estimating peer influence in this particular context. And so the study that I've cited on the slides, one of the best studies that I've read on this topic, in that study argues that there are many factors that confound the peer influence effect in this particular network. It's not, even if you see that farmer A and farmer B both buy the crop insurance, and you know that farmer A and farmer B are connected, it's not enough to conclude that there is peer influence. There could be many other factors. And the paper begins with this story. I'm actually quoting this story from the paper. It actually begins with this paragraph. So suppose there are two friends, Ian and Joey, and Ian's parents ask him, if your friend Joey jumped off a bridge, would you jump too? Right? It's kind of things that parents ask. So you have two friends, Ian and Joey. Joey jumps off a bridge. Why might Ian answer yes? All right, so think about the problem. Two boys, Ian and Joey, on a bridge. Joey jumps off a bridge, and then Ian goes and jumps off the bridge too. Why? Now, I'll tell you the first answer, and this is what I'm interested in. Joey's example inspired Ian. This is peer influence. So I'm Ian. I see my friend who's about to do a really stupid thing, and I say, oh, this looks cool. And I go and do the same thing, right? But this is learning, social learning, influence, right? But what might be other factors that can explain the same behavior? That's what the paper poses. So two individuals, Joey goes and jumps off the bridge. After 5 minutes, Ian goes and jumps off the bridge. One reason is this. What could be other reasons?
Probably they're both prep, like school homework or something like this. Yeah, like a compounder leading to their like similar behavior, but not because they are social influence each other, but for like a common reason leading to that action.
Yes, so that's a good answer. So maybe there is an external factor, in which in this case is homework-induced depression.
Yeah, it's a point that.
Which is a real problem. And so maybe that's causing both Joey and Ian to go and jump off a bridge. The timing is coincidental. So it just so happened that one jumped before the other. The timing is coincidental. But there's an external factor that's pushing it. Any other reason? Yeah.
Maybe the second one will just take the first one and jump.
I'm possible, but let's put an assumption. That's a good answer. It's a new answer. Let's assume that they're both jumping for purely selfish reasons. They're not jumping to anyway help the other.
Maybe the chance so Titanic. Like imitated the behavior jump by jump, maybe from some other outside factors.
Agreement.
Yeah.
No, but I think that the two of you are saying different things. So you're saying there's an external factor that they're responding to?
Yeah, just they're from the film. Some outside factors they're just imitating.
Similar, I think. There's an external factor, and so the timing of who jumps first is a coincidence. There's no real reason why Joey jumped before Ian. But you were saying something different.
Yeah, I think maybe there is a kind of agreement between the like. Yeah, but unfortunately, when people saw their problems, it's not because they want to get the other and this because they economic is changing from some other factors.
So there's a mix of two, right? So there is an economic environment that's pushing them to do it. So I think there's a similar to Roshan's point earlier, but it can also be of mimicking the other, right? Which is, I think, related to stereotypes, I guess. So yeah.
Can it be like Ian's personality traits? Like maybe Ian is like a risk taker or like.
Yes, very good. So Ian's personality trait is that of a risk taker. So Ian likes doing risky things, and so does Joey. Right? Is that the reason?
I assume.
I think same point about whether they sort of have a shared personality trait, so they met each other before because of that. For example,
I guess they like adrenaline, so they both like to try such things like
Such things.
which. So that's like the confounder that sort of explains why they're friends to begin with.
Okay, great, fantastic. So this is external context. I think the point she's making and you're making is selection. So maybe the two individuals, Joey and Ian, became friends because they had a shared interest in doing crazy things. And so it just so happens that on that day, they went to the bridge and jumped. So that is coincidental, but they became friends because of this to begin with. All right, let me show you what the paper says. This is something that we're probably going to think of. Joey's infected Ian with a parasite which suppresses fear of falling. This biological contagion, right? So there's maybe like think of a virus which infects everyone and temporarily takes away your risk perception, right? So this is a possible confound, right? Probably not plausible. So this is what I think a couple of you are mentioning. So Joey and Ian are friends on account of their shared fondness for jumping off bridges. So this is an observed homophily. So we call it homophily because it's similarity based on the focal behavior, because the focal behavior is jumping off bridges, right? It's actually slightly different from what you just mentioned, because here it's not about a trait. Here it's homophily based on the behavior itself, right? So we like jumping off bridges. And that's why we became friends. It sounds weird, but it's possible, right? Then you have a fourth option, which is similar. So they became friends through a thrill-seeking club whose membership rolls are publicly available. So it makes it observed homophily. So you can observe this similarity, but this is on a secondary behavior. So it's not related to, it's not similarity based on jumping off bridges, but it's similarity based on, being part of a thrill-seeking club. And so maybe you have club activities every week, and that week's activity is jumping off bridges, right? So it's a different behavior, but also homophily. And then finally, I think this is what you were referring to earlier, that maybe it's not about the behavior, it's just they have this latent homophily, like homophily based on some latent traits or attitudes. And that's why they became friends. And it's just a coincidence that they jumped off the bridge on that particular day, right? So option 1 is about peer influence. 2, you can ignore because that seems to be an extreme example. 3, 4, and 5 are about homophily. And then 6 is about, similar to what Romshin was mentioned earlier, that maybe they both realize that the bridge is about to collapse. So there's an external shock that they're responding to. There's nothing to do with homophily, nothing to do with influence. They're just responding to an external factor. And again, the timing is coincidental, right? So I think the reason I picked this from the paper is because I wanted to highlight how difficult this empirical problem is. There are at least 5 confounding factors that you have to take care of if you want to cleanly estimate peer influence on networks, right? So this is the challenge here, right? So how do you disentangle peer influence from all these other factors, from homophily, from external factors? And there are studies that have shown that under very special study designs, you might be able to separate these factors. And I'll give you some examples of how you can do that. But I mean, you definitely read that paper, Chalisi and Thomas, because they explain this problem of why it's difficult to estimate peer influence in this context, right? Right, so not all is lost. So I want to show you some sample solutions of studies that have addressed this problem successfully. And there are different kinds of methods that you can use depending on your preference. So now, of course, the most common solution to this problem in any causal study is basically about running experiments, right? So randomized experiment is considered to be a gold standard in causal inference studies. Now, in the context of networks, there are 2 kinds of randomizations that researchers have looked at. The first is what's called a network randomization. And here it's very stylized. So in these kind of studies, what researchers have done is they have randomized the network structure, which is very difficult to do, right? So think about it, right? You assign individuals to a different network structure, which is practically very hard to do in any real context, right? Because you need one network structure for the treatment group people and one network structure from the control group, and that's how you study the effect of network structure. It has feasibility problems. The other more common set of studies are what's called treatment randomization. So here, you don't change the network structure remains the same. You just assign a different treatment to the groups. Right? Now, this is easier to do, but it imposes more statistical requirements in how you estimate the treatment effect. Right? This is commonly used, but it works in specific contexts. I'll show you some examples of that later. But whether you use network randomization or treatment randomization, you're likely to face these challenges. First, of course, there are problems with selection bias. So in any randomization study, maybe you recruit an initial set of nodes, you randomize them, their behavior is likely to be different from the behavior of the nodes that they influence. Just purely because of recruitment effects. Right? So there are selection issues with these kind of studies. The second problem is a major problem, right? So if you do an A/B test or randomized experiment, they're almost always vulnerable to what's called network interference or treatment leakage. What does this mean? Think about how you do randomization in a non-network setting. You take a bunch of people, you randomize them into two groups. And what's the assumption? That the two groups are completely isolated and they're same in every other aspect except for the treatment, right? But here it's difficult to do because a network by definition is connected. So how can you cleanly separate a treatment and a control group in a network? There's always going to be a risk of treatment spillover, right? From one group to the other. Similarly, can you guarantee that even if you randomly pick some nodes, put them into treatment, and randomly pick some nodes and put them into control, their network structure would be the same? So the network structure then becomes a confounding factor in the study, right? So I can actually give you a very real-world example of network interference that I don't know if you probably have faced, but have not realized yet. So when the place where I work, Brandon is familiar with this. We can connect to internet through our LAN, the wired internet, as well as Wi-Fi, right? And I think the same in AUS. So what happened one day is so I was connected to my LAN, and some of my colleagues, they use the Wi-Fi depending on where they're working, right? So the LAN internet connection snapped or disconnected, right? So it randomly disconnected the internet connection for all the people who were at that time connected to LAN, but it did not affect the internet connection of the people who were connected to Wi-Fi. So what would you expect? That so if we're all in our separate cubicles, if I'm working on LAN, I have to stop working because no internet can't work. My colleagues who are working on the Wi-Fi, they can continue working because their internet is still working, right? That's what you expect. But what happened 10 minutes later was no one was working. Everyone was chatting with each other. Why? Because if my internet doesn't work, what I do is I get up and then I walk to my neighboring cubicle and I go, hey, is your internet working? And we start chatting. And then after 5 minutes, no one is working. So that's actually an example of network interference because I get the treatment, right? My internet snapped, but because I'm connected to my neighbors, I almost pass that treatment to my neighbor, even though that person's internet is working. So that's actually a real-world example of network interference in networks. And this complicates when you estimate treatment effect, because even people who don't get the treatment get affected by the treatment because of the spillover, right? So there are all these problems that affect randomization studies in networks. So solution number one, there are a couple of solutions to this problem. A lot of big tech companies run experiments that are called mechanism experiments. They're very clever. So instead of directly changing the network structure or the individual behavior, what they do is they just change the view of the network that the individual sees. So I don't change the network, but using my filtering mechanism, I change what you see of the network. So this is an actual study. So just showing Facebook ads, just showing social cues on Facebook ads, increasing your likelihood of liking that page on Facebook. So this was an experiment that was done on Facebook. So this was, again, way back in the day when Facebook looked like this. you used to see ads for Facebook pages. And can you see the difference between these two versions of the ad? So in version 1, you see the name of the page, the description, and how many people have liked this. But in the second copy of the ad, you don't see the number of people who have liked this, but you see how many of your friends have liked that page, the name of your friend. So this is what's called a social cue, right? So here, I'm not altering the network structure, but I'm actually showing you a certain view of the network and trying to see if this changes your behavior. Right? So this is an example of a mechanism design. So another recent study, I don't know if some of you have seen this study. This was again from Facebook, a little controversial study, where they actually wanted to see if there is evidence of emotion contagion on Facebook without face-to-face interaction. So does emotion spread on Facebook even if there is no face-to-face interaction? And so the actual manipulation was pretty clever, also controversial. So for a period of time, they actually randomized users into a positivity, negativity, and neutral group. In the positivity group, they filtered the newsfeed posts to reduce negative content. In the negativity group, they filtered the newsfeed to reduce positive content. And in the control group, they left it exactly the same. All right. And so this is done on like 689,000 users, a pretty massive experiment. And this is actually what they found. So in the negativity reduced condition, right? So you see the lightly shaded bar is your treatment group. So the users who saw fewer negative posts ended up writing more positive posts on their page and fewer negative posts on their page. And you see on the right-hand side, users who were assigned to the positivity reduced condition. So these users saw fewer positive posts. They ended up writing fewer positive posts and more negative posts. And so they use this as an evidence of emotion contagion. So you see more happy posts, you write more happy posts. You see more negative posts, you write more negative posts. Okay? But again, the reason I'm showing you this is it's a very clever design and it's a mechanism design. So nothing changes in the network, but you only start seeing a certain fraction of posts from a certain part of the network and not others, right? So it's called a mechanism design where you filter the network, and that serves as a treatment. Right? So these are studies that are called mechanism designs as an alternative to randomization. This is also another mechanism design, again, also from Facebook, very famous study, came out in Nature. And this actually showed that Facebook can influence voter turnout in the US. So the context for this was the US congressional elections in 2010. So on the day of the elections, if you're in the US and you logged on to Facebook, we saw one of these two messages, right? So the first is an informational message. And so you can think of this as like a first treatment, right? So you log in, you see this kind of a bar where you can click a link which shows you your nearest polling booth, the number of people who have voted. And if you have voted, you can click that I voted button, and then your friends would get an alert on their newsfeed. And then most people were assigned to this condition, the social message, which is similar to the first, but can you spot the difference? So instead of showing you, so I think, so the social message has an additional bar at the bottom, which shows you which of your friends have actually clicked the I voted button. All right. So this again is a mechanism design because again, the network is the same. All that they're doing is changing your view of the network. And they were able to show that those who had shown the social message bar went out to vote more, and they clicked the I voted button more than the other condition, right? So this was an evidence that Facebook can actually change people's voting behavior it's like a real world impact, right? So it's not just about online behavior. So this was again an example of mechanism design experiment on Facebook. All right, this was solution 1. Now, solution 2 is when we get into quasi-experimental designs, and this is, in terms of method, one of my favorite methods. It's called natural experiments. I think, and for those of you who have studied econometric design, etc., might be familiar with this. And the idea here is, as the name suggests, there is some randomization, but you don't do it. Like God does it for you. So it's an opportunistic, right? So you're given an opportunistic design, you just make use of that. So this is a study from my PhD advisor, and he wanted to study the effect of natural disasters on people's social network behavior. So the context for this study is the Hurricane Ike in the US. And again, this might be unfamiliar context for many of you, but the Hurricane Ike at the time when it happened was the second most costliest hurricane in US history after Katrina. And so when the hurricane struck the US, I think it struck near Texas, and it affected some states, but not others. So in that study, they had a very interesting design. They used a large data set from Facebook of 1.5 million college students in the US. And how do they know where these students are? So they use their college affiliations on the platform. So when you're on Facebook, you list your university. And so they use the university location as a proxy for whether they're affected by the hurricane or not. And so they had this kind of nice kind of matching design where you have the first 5 universities which were directly impacted by the hurricane. And so all students who belong to this university are considered to be the treatment group. And then they had a matched set of 10 universities. These are universities that are similar to the first 5 universities in terms of some university level variables, but were unaffected by the hurricane. So outside the hurricane span. So this was, you can think of these as a control group. And then this looked at how their student social network changed in the weeks after the hurricane. All right, so do they make more friends? Do they make fewer friends, etc.? So if you look at the plots on the right, the red line is your treatment group, so students from the first 5 universities. The blue line is your control group, the students from the next 10 universities. And you see there's no change in the degree after that vertical blue line, which is your hurricane period. So which means that students in both the treatment and control group are making friends at the same rate. There's no change in whether someone's making more friends. However, if you look at the second plot, which is transitivity, which tells you the number of closed triangles in your network. So I'm friends with A is friends with B is friends with me. So it's kind of these transitive triangles, right? And so what the second plot is telling you is in the red line, which is your treatment group, the number of triangles increases after the hurricane, but in the control group, it kind of tapers downwards. So there's more triangles in the treatment group than in the control group. So if you take the first and second plot together, it's an interesting story. So what you're seeing is both groups are making friends at the same rate, but the type of friends you're making is different. So in the treatment group, you're actually making more friends in your immediate local neighborhood. So you're closing more triangles, right? So you're making friends with friends of friends. But in the control group, you're making friends with like random people, the way people make friends on Facebook. So this tells you how people respond after a natural disaster in terms of how your social behavior changes. Anyway, but the reason I'm showing you this study is to show you this design, right? So it's a natural experiment because, well, I didn't bring the hurricane. Now, because there was a hurricane, there is a natural split. There is a treatment control split that I can exploit to get a treatment effect, right? So this is again solution 2. Okay. There's the reason there's no solution 3. There was a solution 3 that removed is a simple solution. Sometimes tech companies roll out solutions you might see that sometimes you have new features implemented first in Singapore or in New Zealand, and then it gets rolled out to US or other bigger countries. And so sometimes you have these natural partitions that can serve as treatment or control groups that tech companies use. A better way of doing that is solution 4, which is what's called graph cluster randomization. And this is like a generalization of your natural randomization technique, but the idea is very clever. So if network interference is the major problem in networks, what researchers have done is you take a network, you try to partition the network into two clusters or two or more clusters, such that the number of interconnections between the clusters is minimized. It's how you do cluster analysis, right? So you have clusters that are separated in space, and then you assign entire clusters to the treatment or control group. So here you're not assigning an individual node, you're assigning a community of nodes to the treatment and control, with the assumption that communities by design are isolated from other communities, right? And again, there are ways to do these kind of partitioning. So there are algorithms that you can use, like community detection methods in networks, or you can also use natural partitions like pre-existing countries, right? So that can also serve as partitions of the network. And finally, if you can't do any of those things, if you can't do mechanism designs, you don't have a natural experiment, you're not able to partition the network, you can depend on purely observational approaches based on secondary data. And here, these are econometric models that you can use. The problem with these methods is they are very assumption intensive, so you have to make a lot of assumptions in these models, but they can be used depending on whether the assumptions make sense in that particular context. So in my own study, for example, I use this particular model called the stochastic graph models by Snyder's quite often. And I'll show you an example of how this model works. But I just wanted to highlight that there are also purely observational methods that you can use for estimating pure influence. Not as preferred as the previous methods, but if this is your only option, you have to use these. Right, to summarize, I've shown you two kinds of methods, experimental and non-experimental. The advantage, of course, with experimental methods is, like all experimental techniques, these are ideal for causal testing. If you can do an experiment, that's the gold standard. And you can study any behavior that you can manipulate inside a lab, right? So you have control over what you can do. Disadvantage is what's called ecological validity in quantitative studies. So there are many kinds of interventions that don't make sense inside a lab. So like I've read papers where they have tried to manipulate friendship inside a lab, where they recruit people and then tell the participants that pretend you're best friends for the next 1 hour, right? And I mean, I can imagine the benefits of doing that, but that's not how people make friendship, right? So that's an ecological validity problem, that maybe you're getting some estimates, but is it really measuring what you want to measure, right? And finally, for field experiments like the hurricane study or all the experiments that Facebook ran, they're expensive to run, time consuming, and like unless you own the platform, it's generally very hard to do it. So it's a lot of investment. Compared to that, the non-experimental methods like the econometric techniques are relatively easy. As long as you have a network and behavior data set, you can estimate some of these models. However, these are assumption intensive. You have to make very strong assumptions, and sometimes these are not valid, right? So very briefly, I want to show you this particular model because this is something that I use a lot in my own studies. Stochastic actor-oriented models kind of bring in the best of simulation-based models like agent-based simulations and combine that with the ease and flexibility of regression-based models. So there's a lot of history on simulation-based models in networks. So a lot of you might be familiar with agent-based simulations. But the problem with agent-based simulations is they were not designed for hypothesis testing. They were mainly designed for tracking emergent properties of the network. Conversely, econometric models or regression-based models were designed for hypothesis testing, but they were not designed for modeling interactions between users. However, there's these new classes of models, well, they're not new anymore, but relatively newer than regression models, that try to combine the flexibility of agent-based simulations in terms of modeling interactions with giving you a regression-based specification where you can do all the things that you can do with linear regression, specifying variables, estimating parameters, tracking counterfactuals, etc. So if you're familiar with random graph models, also called ERGMs, some of you might be familiar, they're similar to that, but SAOMs are mainly used for dynamic networks over time, so longitudinal networks. I'll show you an example of that. The only downside with this model is it operates under very strong Markovian assumptions, which means that you have to assume that the state of a network at any given point in time is completely explained by the state of the network in the previous time period, which can be a strong assumption if there are external shocks, all right? So without getting into the details of this model, I just had this one slide to show you, give you an intuition behind how this model works. So imagine you have a network data set which looks like this. So you have two waves of network. And so the links are the friendship network and the nodes are individuals. And let's imagine that a dark node is a node that is a smoker and a white node is a node that's a non-smoker. And the links are friendships, right? And so you have two states of the network in your data set. So time period 0 and time period 1. What this model does is it simulates micro steps. So this is a simulation. It simulates hundreds and thousands of these micro steps, but at each micro step, you are allowed to make exactly one change to the network, exactly one change. So you can add a tie, or you can delete a tie, or you can change the behavior of exactly one node, right? And the model simulates these micro steps over and over and over again till the network structure converges to the observed network at T1, right? And then obviously there are questions about, well, how frequent are these micro steps? And how do we know what change to make at a particular micro step, like what tie to add or delete or what behavior to change? And for that, you have these two functions, the rate function and a utility function. And the utility function is basically like a regression function, right? So you specify the utility function based on effects that you want to include in the model. And once the model converges, you can back out the parameters of this utility function. And that can explain how this model evolved from T0 to T1. Okay, I'm simplifying it a bit. I'll give you some reading material on how this model works. But just to highlight that this is a dynamic network model that you can use to explain what factors contribute to the model evolution between two observed states of the network in a regression-like model specification. All right. So I want to just take the final 5 or 10 minutes to give you an example of some studies that I've done using SAOMs, the model that I've just showed you. Actually, I should highlight that it has a very nice R package that you can use and so much to estimate this model. So there's a very neat R package called R Sienna. So you don't have to really code all of these steps. You just have to specify the model, pass the data, and you can run this model very easily. So it's very convenient. Right, so I just wanted to quickly give you like a preview of some studies that I've done in the past and currently working on, which use the stochastic actor-oriented models. The first study that I want to highlight is from my thesis. Here, again, let me just simplify the problem. So imagine that this is a Facebook network, okay? The real network is slightly bigger than this. Let's assume that it's a 4-node network. This is me, and I have 3 best friends on the platform. And the problem that I'm interested in is, let's imagine if Mark Zuckerberg and Kim Jong-un increases their posting behavior, what does that do to my posting behavior? All right. So if both of them start posting a lot, what happens to my posting rate? Now, there's the one hypothesis states that, oh, maybe I learn from them and I start posting more, right? So it's positive influence. There's a competing hypothesis which says, maybe I see that, oh, they're already posting so much, there's no need for me to post. So I free ride on their posts. I'm just a lurker. I just read other people's posts and I reduce my posting. So that's negative influence. Or there could be no effect, right? I don't care what these people are posting, I just do my own thing. So this is the research question that I wanted to study, right? How do users' online contribution evolve as a function of their network? So in this case, those 3 individuals, as well as my own individual attributes, right? So my gender, my age, how long I've been on the platform, etc. So this is the key empirical challenge. So do we see evidence of peer influence after accounting for all those 6 Ian and Joey factors, right? And then finally, this is something I was very interested in, that do these effects depend on the specific level of the behavior? So would my behavior or would the influence be different if I'm an active poster, like I'm an influencer posting every day, or versus I'm a very infrequent poster. I rarely post on social media. So would these influence effects be different from highly active versus inactive social media users? So this is one study, and so we actually found in the paper that there is positive effects and that highly active users show stronger influence than less active social media users. But this is one study where I was estimating peer influence on social media in a content generation behavior context.
Sorry,
Yeah.
can I check? So how was homophily sort of conceptualized and measured? So it's in this case demographic attributes, for example, gender and all.
So there was homophily based on age.
Mm,
Homophily, I don't think there was gender, I think there was age.
mm,
And then there was social network age, like how long I've been on the platform.
mm,
So there's two individuals whose social network age is similar.
mm,
I also modeled that in the
mm.
SAOM and see if the
Okay.
parameter is significant or not.
Then we also sort of assess, I guess, I mean, because this is a hypothetical example, but given that the people at the tree are more influential, have more followers and people following,
Mm.
you also sort of control for that, or that's.
I did not in this particular study, but you're right. I could add an effect to see if this effect is stronger. So this inbound influence, if it's
Yeah.
stronger for peers who are in terms of popular.
Yeah, okay.
So that's a nice thing about the SAOM model, that you can be creative over what you want to model. Because that could be an interesting research question, right? Like, is the influence stronger from more popular neighbors?
Okay, then just one follow-up question is, then how do you decide which factors to sort of control for homophily? So in the literature, is there certain variables? So I understand like what you said, right? Just now earlier, we also talked about other types of homophily, like for example, more latent unobservable one. So like personality, given that there's like some research about how you can sort of infer personality traits based on the kind of content you post and the kind of content you sort of consume. Is there some like work on that in network science as well?
Yeah, so I think there are two questions that you have.
Yeah.
I think the second question is latent homophily. So anything that you're not capturing in the data is very common in social networks. There are statistical ways to correct for that. So it's not controlling for that,
Okay.
but you can see how sensitive your model is to latent homophily.
Okay. So how it changes.
Yeah. So like how sensitive are your estimates to the presence of some latent confounders? I think the first part of the question is, how do I even know what homophily to model? And for that, actually, we depend on the past literature to see in this kind of context, what kind of homophily has been found.
Okay, for social media, for the behavior of interest.
Yeah,
Okay.
for the behavior of interest.
Okay, thank you so much.
So this is one context. I have another paper currently working on, same problem, now in a different context on academic outcomes. So here we're actually looking at a large social network of students who are interacting online through an online forum, right, within a university. And we are trying to first see, do students make ties based on homophily in academic performance? In other words, do we see evidence that the high-performing students only interact with other high-performing students, and the mid-performing students and low-performing students only interact with the mid-performing and low-performing students? That has actually been studied. So there are papers looking at what's called the rich club phenomenon in schools, where you kind of see that high-performing students only form their own cliques, where they only interact with their own specific friends, and they're very exclusive. They don't want to interact with non-high-performing students, right? You can imagine why. So do we see evidence of that here? Second, we try to see, once these interaction networks are formed, does that then have a peer influence on academic outcomes? So do my friends influence my academic performance based on these interaction networks? And then finally, I think this is not, I think the arrow is not correct, but we actually see if your centrality in the interaction network has a role to play in your labor market outcomes in terms of what kind of jobs you get and what's your starting salary. So there's a lot of studies which show that high centrality individuals tend to land higher paid jobs, but then there's some confusion about how to measure centrality in a college network. So you're trying to see if there's evidence of that. right? And finally, I think similar to the previous study, we tried to see if this link between networks and academic performance, the peer influence, do these peer and peer effects vary with students' academic abilities? So do high-performing and low-performing students show different homophily and different peer influence? And we actually do find significant differences. And you can imagine this is important for universities to know, because if your high-performing students form their own exclusive groups and they don't interact or with the other students, then the benefits of teaching gets kind of limited to one cluster inside the class and doesn't spread to other students. And you need other kind of interventions to make sure that there's things that spread. I'm reminded there was a study which didn't get published in the US where the professor ran an experiment in the classroom where you have these project groups that are formed at the beginning of the semester. So he let students form their own project groups with one constraint. Because when you ask students to form your own project groups, you know what happens, right? You form groups with your friends. So what the professor did was something interesting. He said, look, you form your own project groups, but what I'm going to do is at the end of the semester, I'm going to fit a distribution within each group. So, which means that within each group, there's going to be one person with an A, one person with a B, one person with a C. So now you figure out how you want to form your group. So now what that does is it disincentivizes the rich club, because now high-performing students don't want to form a group with each other because, well, what if the other person gets an A, and then I have to get a B or a C because there's a distribution within the group, right? And then the study didn't take off because it was like complete chaos and they couldn't form a group. But this is an interesting assignment, and it is a very extreme example of what you can do to prevent these rich clubs from forming. There are obviously better ways of doing it, but this is an example of how group assignment actually affects academic performance towards the end. Finally, this is something that I'm currently working on, where we're looking at this problem of inferring the effect of a policy in a social network. So imagine if I'm the government or I'm some a tech company, and I want to, if I'm the government, I want to roll out a new policy, or if I'm Facebook or TikTok, I have a new feature that I want to introduce in a social network. The problem is, what happens if there is treatment spillover from those who are in the treatment group to those who are in the control group? And how do I assess the treatment effect of this policy or of this feature in a completely unbiased way, right? So that's the empirical challenge. So this is what we're trying to do in this paper. So trying to isolate the direct effect of this policy from the underlying network effects that you're likely to see. And then finally, also estimating the net effect of the policy, which is a combination of the direct effect and any indirect effects from the network. As a follow-up to the study, we are also looking at policy contagion, right? So maybe you pick 50 nodes for the initial policy intervention, but over time, you see that they diffuse the effects of the policy through the network. And so you don't have to pick everyone for the policy treatment. So you can actually have a very efficient policy rollout where you only select a small sample of nodes, but because of the contagion effect, they're able to influence many other people in the network, right? So in this particular paper, we actually show that your initial sampling technique, the way you sample nodes for the treatment, plays a major role in your estimating the direct and the net treatment effect. And so this is something that policymakers should be aware of. So these are just some studies that I wanted to give you like a preview of stuff that, the kind of stuff that you can do where with network effect problems, right? With the problem of peer influence.
Sorry, a quick question. So in this study, when we are looking at the impact of policy change on social networks, like how did you choose a control group that's not affected by the policy change? Like, or is it not something you're looking at?
Yeah, so the choice of sampling strategy is the final bullet point. So that determines what the control group is. So like a very naive baseline with your random sampling. Right? So you take a network, you randomly pick n nodes for your policy rollout, and then the rest of the nodes act as the control. But that's a bad design because then your treatment and control groups are very different. There are other kinds of sampling strategies. So for example, in this study, we look at something called independent set sampling, where you pick n nodes for the treatment, but the independent set sampling technique ensures that those n nodes are not adjacent to each other. So they are not connected. So think about it. So it's n nodes who are not connected to each other. So we make sure that there is no treatment spillover within the treatment group. So like imagine if the two of us receive the treatment, but if we are also friends, then I'm also influencing your behavior. So you kind of get double the treatment. So there's the one particular sampling technique minimizes that. So depending on the choice of the sampling technique, your control group naturally changes. Yeah.
So you minimize the potential force of the node.
Or the spillover.
The spillover effect.
Yeah. And then we have an SAOM model, which can also explicitly estimate the influence when there is a spillover. So the way it's a little complicated design. So the sampling technique ensures that there is minimum spillover in the immediate term after the policy. There's a short time span within which you can study the direct effect when there is no spillover. But then over time, you cannot prevent spillover because it's not perfectly isolated, right? So over time, there will be more and more spillover. And then we have a way of estimating that. And so the net effect that I mentioned there is that sum of the direct effect, which is measured in a very small period of time after the policy, plus the indirect effect, which we observe over a much longer period of time. Yeah, so that's how we can do it. Yeah, thanks.
When you choose the independent set, which is the social network that you're working on?
Yes, that's a very good question. This is currently purely a simulation study. So we simulate a certain network structure, but you're right that for this to be practically useful, you need access to the contact network. So the policymaker needs to have access to the network it wants to roll out the policy on, so that they can estimate the independent set. And we have an extension to this study where we're looking at independent set computation in an incompletely observed network, where you don't observe all the links perfectly.
Because ideally, we have in a large network web, we have approximately 6 hops to reach from one node to the other. So how wouldn't it be too ideal to assume that the independent set is isolated and members of the independent set are isolated from one another a considerable period of time?
So think about it this way. If there's A and B are both part of the independent set, and the entire independent set is treated. All right. So A and B both get the policy treatment in T0. And so my assumption is that T0.5, and immediately after the treatment, A and B, there's no spillover because they're not directly connected. However, you're right, C can be a mutual neighbor. So the treatment would move from A to C and then from C to B. So there would be multi-hop spillover in the network, which I think what you're referring to. The assumption that I'm making in this study is it will at least take one time period for that to happen.
The time should be defined if you've not observed it over the real network.
Yes, but we're doing some analysis to kind of put the bounds on what's the maximum time period after which you're likely to see at least one infection within the treatment group.
The reason why I asked that was I thought you had arrived at the end of number, which would considerably delay, but for which you could assume that the two members were isolated and we could infect an individual without the other not knowing it for a certain time period. So I thought you had arrived at the numbers of n and p in this case, the n hops and time period.
The time period P is something we have right now, but you're right. We don't have a bound on the number of hops yet.
Maybe it's contingent upon a lot of processes in sharing.
Yeah, but I think that's a good point. We should think about this. Okay, so with that, so there's some key insights from this set of studies that I showed you on social influence. So first, social influence on online platforms can lead to quantifiable gains in behavior and performance. So these studies that I've just showed you are in very different contexts. I hope they're all roughly on the topic of social influence. So I'm hoping that you're convinced that this is something useful to study. Second, across all these studies, we find evidence of heterogeneity, at least in the first two studies, where we have actual data. We do find that highly active, high-performing individuals tend to show very different network effects from low-performing individuals, again, in very different contexts, whether it's content generation, academic performance. So that's something that we see in these studies. And finally, I think the implication of this line of research is, if you know that social influence exists, if you can quantify it, can you design interventions to make use of that, right? Can I now seed certain nodes in the network and then observe how the network, how the influence affects the behavior spreading over time? In terms of challenges that we face in this line of work that we're trying to address, first, I think, of course, this is a question on already. There are many layers of the network we don't observe, right? So maybe I only observe the Facebook network, but I don't know what they're doing offline, right? So this creates challenges in how do you model latent effects in the network model. So I have borrowed ideas from this Davin et al. Paper to statistically correct for any error that's introduced by latent homophily. But this is, again, a very open area of work. I'm sure there's a better way of doing this. Second, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, there is, I think, a lot of discussions now on interaction networks as opposed to social networks. And so if you have interaction networks, it's really challenging to understand what's really going on in the interaction qualitatively, right? So imagine if you have two students who are interacting on a homework, what we can quantify is maybe the number of messages they're sending each other. But if I don't know the exact content or what's there in those messages, I don't really know the depth of these interactions, right? I think this is where maybe a lot of qualitative studies are very useful, because they can really capture the quality of some of these social interactions, which quantitative studies find it hard to do with just existing measures. And finally, for some of the models that I currently use, the like SAOM model, there are very strong assumptions, like Markovian assumptions, that might not be true in many contexts, right? So if there's COVID-19, which creates a huge external shock, we don't model it in our current models. That can be a major violation of assumptions, but this is something that we have to live with, right? This is like the price you pay for using an observational data model, not doing an experiment, right? Good, so with that, just have some parting thoughts for the day. I hope that in the past 1 hour or so, I've been able to impress upon you that networks are both interesting to study and useful for your own line of work. That social networks are critical to understanding many different aspects of society and business, but that access to data is obviously a challenge, so we have to be clever about how we construct networks, maybe depending on simulation studies more and more. Finally, I think there's a lot of studies are now shifting from relational networks like social networks to more constructed networks like interaction, co-location, cooperation, these kind of networks, which are constructed from data. And finally, I think this is my own area of work. It's estimating causal processes on networks are very challenging, also very interesting. And I think they're very critical to policy, because if you can show that they exist, you can design policy interventions based on these insights, right? So finally, I just want to leave you with, on a lighter note, this joke, something that I heard at a conference many years ago, stuck with me, so I want to share it with you. I think the presenter was also a very senior social scientist. And I think his point was, there are two types of social scientists in this world. First, those who study social network problems. Second, those who study social network problems but haven't realized it yet. So I think the point they're making was, it's so pervasive that if you go home today and think about the kind of problem that you work on and ask yourself, is there a network component to this? I think 8 out of 10 times you realize that there is a network component you're not thinking about. All right, so I just wanted to finally just give a shout out to some of my collaborators whose work I've shown in this particular presentation. If you have anything that's interested you about this presentation or something you want to chat about, you can talk to me in the break, or you can drop me an email. And well, thank you for your attention and patience. I hope you found this interesting. Right?